Hi, folks. We're here for a discussion of the panel, The French and Other Cultures. I'm Colin Foss. I'm assistant professor of French at Austin College in Texas, and I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves.
Yeah, hi, bonjour, kia ora. I'm William Jennings from the University of Waikato in New Zealand, where I teach French history. I'm particularly interested in contact in the 17th through to the 19th centuries in the French colonial context. And I'm working on a book manuscript about the manuscript of the covered in the paper I've presented.
Wonderful, nice to meet you. My name is Benjamin Hoffmann. I'm an associate professor of early modern French studies at The Ohio State University, which I joined back in 2015. And so at Ohio State, I teach creative writing and 18th century French culture, occasionally modern French literature as well. And I'm currently working on a new novel and as well on this general project about the introduction of Buddhism in the Western world during the early modern period.
All right. Well, first I want to thank you both for the really amazing papers that you recorded that we saw earlier. I thought maybe just start out sort of with a really general question. Excuse me. Both of you set up your analyses in these papers in opposition to a different methodology or a different interpretation. So in William Jennings' case, it's the description of the lives of enslaved people on the plantation. Of course, Goupil's text here is sort of a corrective to a lot of archives and a lot of other texts where we don't see sort of the daily life or even sort of the humanity of these people on the plantation. And so you're sort of working in opposition to this what you describe in your paper, or as you cite in your paper, this kind of creative imagining that one must do to imagine the for Benjamin Hoffmann, you focus on the forgotten 18th century origins of the cult of nothingness interpretation of Buddhism, which, as you point out, has often been sort of located in this interpretation of Buddhism in the 19th century. And so I wanted to ask about your own methodologies when you do this. Why are your corrections to the scholarly record, why are they important? Why is this a needed thing for us to do? And so I'll let you.
Well, yeah, my one, I think part of it is, as I said in the concluding remarks to the paper, I'm a little concerned that people tend to extrapolate from what's known from the 19th and latter half of the 18th centuries, and they assume that the institution of slavery was the same throughout the period when, but it's not the case when you look at those foundational documents. And we see, very much in Europe, in the late 1600s, people didn't know a lot about what was going on the plantations, particularly not in France. Beyond the ports and the colonial companies, people didn't know a lot about it, and so there wasn't this widespread information. It wasn't disseminated until the Enlightenment. So I think it's very important for people to understand the foundational period and to see that it was quite different. So in some ways, it's not so much a challenge to the methodology, but a challenge to the extrapolations that concern me. And I'm fortunate enough to be working with the manuscript that provides the detail, so I don't have to resort to these imagined reconstructions. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So in my case, I think it's quite obvious when you read the paper and also the longer version. I'm thinking about publishing from this paper that the point of departure is the book by Roger Paul Drouin, Le Culte du Néant, which is an absolutely wonderful book. I mean, I loved it. I think it's a pioneer book in many respects. That's precisely focused on the 19th century and on this intellectual tradition built around Hegel that goes from Hegel to Nietzsche to Schopenhauer as well. But I had some issues reading that extraordinary and groundbreaking work in many respects, especially discovering the introduction of that book that goes very, very rapidly when it's dealing with everything that came before the 19th century. And I think something that has been underlined by another great scholar whose name is Urs App, who's the author of a book called the Cult of not nothingness, but the Cult of Emptiness, a tendency that consists in saying that basically the intellectual serious discovery of this religious phenomenon known as Buddhism happened in the 19th century, really the first decades of the 19th century, around the 1820s, and that basically everything that happened before was insignificant, was not very scientific, was a kind of a collection of error, mistakes, projections of the European psyche, projection as well of the beliefs of those Christian people. And that pretty much like everything that came before this clear-cut rupture was not, could not be deemed significant enough to become the object of a scholarly discussion. And I think that when you start creating those pretty artificial historical boundaries, you really isolate yourself. You really tend to create boundaries that do not exist in the intellectual world. They are more the object of a kind of a projection of your current knowledge on what happened before. And so the goal of this project is to underline, and I'm by no means the first one to do that. I've just mentioned the name of Urs App. I could also mention the work of Donald Lopez, who is an extraordinary scholar of Buddhist studies. But my goal is to really underline that what happened before the 19th century was also significant. That there was like a real intellectual attempt to deal with those very sources, to deal with those testimonies coming from extremely far away, like from 16th century Japan, from 17th century Eastern China, and to try to understand their way of constructing this intellectual object that was not called Buddhism at the time, that was called, thanks to a tremendous array of designations, such as the cult of Sakya, the cult of Buddha, but nonetheless, people had, despite those, differences in the terminology, people did have the conscience that this was a homogeneous religious phenomenon. And so the idea is to, go back in time and show that not only what happened before the 1820s was extremely significant intellectually speaking, but also had an impact on those thinkers that started their work after the so-called discovery of Buddhism, after the so-called start of the intellectual, serious, scholarly discovery of Buddhism.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, you were saying, people imagine that Buddhism was this one kind of monolithic idea, and I'm struck by the idea that people here, it seems to you're talking about sort of Europeans thinking about this, like Western folks thinking about this, and I think that in both of your papers, you work with sort of European texts to imagine that imagine otherness, right? European texts that talk about otherness, and so I wanted to sort of ask about. To give examples of this from your talk, Ben Hoffmann, you suggest, that Bale and his other folks in Europe that talked about Buddhism, they're actually talking about themselves when they talk about Buddhism, right? That they're actually talking about Europe, and they're not talking about Buddhism per se. And so I think with Ben, I'm wondering if in your own research, do you attempt to talk about Buddhism per se, or as a Western scholar educated in France and the US, does your work have the same sort of limitations, right? In your work on Buddhism, are you talking about Buddhism or are you talking about Europe? And so I think for William Jennings too, I mean, you're also using a sort of European text and you're very aware of the sort of limitations of this text, as you both are, I think. But I wonder if you think that, Goupy, where are the limits of him being able to discuss enslaved people on his plantation where he was the manager, and so I'm wondering if in his descriptive regime that you described so well in your paper, what sort of limits do you see there? Where do you see the even if he does speak quite a bit about their humanity, about their daily lives, where does that end? Are there definitive limits to it, or does it depend on what he's talking about?
you know, this is one of the curious things, because we're at an age, well, I was going to say it's before the noble savage, which isn't quite true. But he doesn't consider them, the otherness is not as strong. And I think it's because of his experience in West Africa. Because for a lot of early planters and missionaries and visitors' descriptions, very often you get that sense of otherness. But we are, again, we're before the, you know, the Enlightenment noble savage, where, and again, I feel that's the same thing as with what I read in towards the end of your paper, then, the fact that the, you know, when we're talking about the noble savage, we're actually talking about ourselves. And that was, well, as far as the European tradition went. So this is one thing I find very different with Gupi's manuscript, is that he's not taking that approach. And again, part of it's the earliness, but I think most of it is his particular background.
When did he write his manuscript again? What was the like specific?
1690.
1690. So I believe it comes like before the publication of Lahontan, les dialogues du baron de Lahontan avec un sauvage. I think it's like Lahontan is really the very first year of the 18th century. So he also comes before like this construction, this intellectual construction of the sauvage that restarts with, in many respects, with Lahontan, and that really become extremely popularized by the writing of Rousseau. So
yeah, but you could go back to Montaigne.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And would you actually go back to Montaigne to sort of understand Gupi's relationship to the people he writes about?
No, not too much. Well, one of the things that's quite odd with his writing is that he hardly says anything about the Native Americans, whereas most people who visited talked an enormous amount about the Native Americans and their system of beliefs and their cultural practices. And they mentioned the enslaved people as an afterthought, a footnote, effectively. And Gupi's not doing that. It's this question. I mean, we're dealing with two others, which makes things quite complicated. And what you get in those situations, I've found, because I've seen it as well with New Zealand history with French missionaries in New Zealand, is that one of the others tends to be associated very much with the self, and then the other one becomes the diametrical opposite. But yeah, the fact that Gupi is talking so much about Africans and so little about Native Americans is certainly very unusual, and it does break with that. Well, I'd hesitate to call it a tradition, but you know, I mean, travel writing sold very, very well. Books of travel writing, really, from the early 1600s, we've got Muki, and about 1617, I think. So they sold very, very well. So there's a widespread knowledge of other cultures, or at least explorers' views of other cultures, but not much about the Africans, unfortunately.
Ben, did you want to? I sort of asked you a relatively personal question, saying, you know, your own limitations writing about Buddhism. But I'm wondering, you know, in this, not just in this paper that you gave, but in sort of your larger project, do you address Buddhism per se, or are you sort of is this a European research?
You know, in my specific project, it's more like the European perception of Buddhism. It's more, you know, the intellectual dialogue that a number of European thinkers, Bell would be one of them, Diderot would be another like prominent thinker in this genealogy of the understanding of Buddhism in the West, would be another really important figure in the project. But I would say, I mean, your question is extremely interesting. In many respects, I think you're really touching really at the core of the difficulties of any kind of research that's about the perception of the other. I was always like going to comment on the fact that those texts that deal with the representation of the others are a perception, a projection of the European psyche, of the European dilemmas, of the European culture, that's in a way that tries to figure out its own problems by looking at the other. I think it's very much the case when you touch the representation of Buddhism in the West. That's absolutely right. That people, as I try to show in the conclusion of my presentation, try to address the prevalent question of their time through their analysis of really what is entirely foreign to them. In a way, I don't think we should really criticize them for that, because we talk about like human beings who are like dealing with extremely like strange, foreign, complicated, like cultural, religious phenomena. And especially in the case of Buddhism, we're talking about a religious system that's really trying to embrace the whole of reality, to create a moral system, to create a kind of understanding of the way the individual and the collective, the individual and the universe are interacting. Because the idea of like co-relations, the idea of like the unity of everything, the connection of the mind and the word is like very key and one of the key elements to understand Buddhism. And so you have this extremely wide, complex, like nexus of ideas. And in a way, when a European thinker is trying to comment on this like galaxy of ideas, there is necessarily what I call in the paper an operation of selection. You're going in a way to select an idea, a concept, because it has a kind of personal resonance for you as a member of a particular singular culture and era. And it's what I was trying to show at the end of the talk, that basically the idea that Buddhism could be today a cult of emptiness, that it could be this kind of like very dim religion that advocating for the destruction of the self, would be like, if you present it to like anybody who's not very well versed in the history of Buddhism, would be like completely like surprising, because it's really at odds with our mental construction of what this religion is, which is much more about, kind of, as I said, like kind of balance, a kind of search for autonomy, harmony, and everything that you can like call designate with the word Zen in a way. And this is the kind of new simplification, the new reinterpretation that's going on now. But I would say that one of the very specificities of the European construction of Buddhism, if you really compare it to any other kind of engagement between European people and figures of otherness, is the fact that Buddhism is actually fairly unknown to us. We're talking about a religion that's extremely old, like 6th century before Christ, that's tremendously complicated, that has an extension throughout Asia with widely different beliefs, systems, a religion that's really advocating on the idea of the autonomy of the self, the autonomy of one's intelligence to construct his or her own understanding of what the religion is. So you have this really like extraordinary, like space-like construction, intellectual construction. And in many respects, this phenomenon of introduction of like cultural engagement between Western thinkers and Buddhism is fairly like recent, in the sense that many of these ideas have reached, singular people throughout the time, throughout history, but as really a kind of discourse that is the object of a scientific study in universities. For example, it's still fairly recent 19th century construction. So in a way, when I think about Buddhism, I always think about this saying by Saint-Just, who said, I believe, le bonheur est une idée neuve en Europe. In a way, Buddhism is an idée neuve en Europe as well. It's something that we're still trying to figure out.
I wonder, I'm glad that you brought up the sort of the culture aspect of this, which is, of course, the title of this panel, the French and Other Cultures. And I know that you didn't decide on the title of this panel, that it was sort of given to you, but I thought we might use that as maybe a point of departure to think about the concept of culture and how it relates to your papers. Because it's actually, I think, and maybe in the vein of kind of the best titles, it's kind of deceiving to talk about the French meeting other cultures in both of your papers, because in William Jennings, of course, the French aren't encountering different cultures here. They're enslaving people. You know, this is sort of seems naive to maybe think about it as an encounter of cultures. And for Ben, I'm wondering, you know, the French here, the way that you understand it, is also not a monolithic idea, right? That there were of course like different religions within France that may have encountered Buddhism in different ways. And so I guess I maybe want to start to just use that title as a jumping off point. How does culture fit into the idea of culture fit into your research? Is it a phenomenon? Is it sort of a concept that has some pull? Does it mean something? Or is it something that we maybe want to sort of discard in favor of a different idea? And also, you know, just criticizing the idea of like the French, you know, as sort of this one monolithic unity too.
Yeah, well, I would say it's not just, I mean, the idea of, well, something I found, I mean, more and more, just especially when you're reading manuscripts, not even published versions, is you get a sense of the individual rather than the culture. So you get this, you know, well, in linguistics, you talk about an idiolect, you know, someone's personal language. And you get the sense very much that each writer has their own personal culture. So you know, Goupil's a Parisian, a bourgeois Parisian. He's got a particular view of the world that might not be shared by a missionary from Normandy, even though they're seeing the same, they're witnessing the same cultural practices from another culture. So I'm getting the sense more and more that we're dealing with individuals rather than, as you say, that these ideas of, you know, concepts of a monolithic culture, and that applies not only to the self but also to the other. So that you know, one person's perception of that cultural practice is not going to be reflected. I guess very much like what you've been saying about the interpretation of Buddhism. It will vary according to what the reader or the wants it. And on top of that, I imagine there would be a double refraction as well, because the Western interpretation of Buddhism at the time would have passed through accounts by travelers and visitors and so on. So you've got their distortion, and then on top of that, you've got the reader back in France, or in Europe, I should say, interpreting it in their fashion. So that you've got that double effect going on, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, Colin, you're absolutely right to point towards the monolithic nature of the concept of culture. Of course, it should be like at the very least cultures, and thus, and so for like a variety of reasons. First, to go back to those different thinkers, early modern thinkers. I'm mostly like focusing on the 17th century and the 18th century. The various thinkers who are undertaking the analysis and the commentary of Buddhism belong to like widely different intellectual, cultural, and religious groups. Let's take, for example, the example of Bell, who is in exile, who is working his dictionary, his historical and critical dictionary, popularizing the theories of Spinoza and atheism as well. And then you have like also thinkers like Voltaire, who has written like quite extensively on Buddhism, was written about the character he called Samono Kodom, who is like one of the many names of the Buddha in our 18th century culture. And who talks about this question from a very different point of view, which is not like an atheist point of view like Bell or Diderot, for example, but much more with the perspective of a deist who wants to see at times, who wants to construct the idea of Buddhism as a kind of possible alternative to Christianity. And so there is like variety and heterogeneity when you look at the European commentators of Buddhism, but there is also a tremendous heterogeneity when you look at the actual culture they're talking about. But if you talk about, for example, Buddhism at the time, they might have been like commenting on Thai Buddhism, for example, from Siam, on Chinese Buddhism. In many respects, what Bell mentions in his article about Spinoza and the kind of parallel he draws with Spinoza and the sect Foekia, or the Buddhist sect, actually comes from Japan, 16th century Japan. So you have this heterogeneity. And actually, it's even more complicated than that, because these thinkers had a tendency to see a kind of cultural continuity between religions that are actually constructed today as radically different. To give a first example, Diderot, for example, talks about the Buddhist Brahman, and think that there is a kind of continuity between Brahmanism and Buddhism, and talks about Buddhist people as if they belong to the Brahmanic religion. So that's one example. And there is another example that would be my last one, and that's even more, I think, bizarre in our current and contemporary perspective, is the kind of genealogy that they built between Egypt, old Egypt, during the antiquity, and Buddhism. There was this pretty widespread theory that was born in particular in the writing of Engelbert Kämpfer, was one of the very prominent European commentator in Japan at the end of the 17th century. There was this theory that actually Buddhism came from ancient Egypt for actually two main reasons, because they had this concept of transmigration, and so there was this idea that transmigration was common to both ancient Egypt and Buddhism. And there was also this idea, and that's something that you even find pretty late in the 19th century, this idea that the Buddha had curly hairs, and those curly hairs that you can see in statues were actually very close to some of the representation you could find in ancient Egypt. And so there was this theory of a continuity between two widely different cultures that we have learned to differentiate. So actually, we really need to get rid of a unified and monolithic concept of culture, and really think about all these connection between things that we have a tendency to nowadays separate. Separate in terms of different religious systems, but also separate in terms of historical genealogies.
I want to come back to then something that you said in a second about Voltaire's idea of Buddhism and sort of as an alternative. But I want to put a pin in that for 1 second, because that was a really fascinating idea. But for Professor Jennings, I was wondering to bring back something you were saying about idiolects and sort of the sort of individual, maybe thinking about individuals rather than cultures. In your paper, you note that Goupy reports the speech of many of the enslaved people on his plantation in Cayenne, which sort of leads you to make a distinction between enslaved Africans as, I think you call them labor units versus individuals. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I was wondering, this also reminds me, of course, of the fact that Goupy was using the real names of these enslaved Africans rather than French names, which is another way of sort of reclaiming this individuality. I sort of wanted to push you a bit on, or push you to speak a little bit more about this distinction between labor units and individuals, because it's hard for me to sort of accept the idea that Goupy is seeing them as individuals when he was actively participating in enslaving them, and also actively participating in their forced enslavement because he was the manager of this plantation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And so I'm wondering too, so I'm wondering if was individuals. It seems maybe to go too far to see them as being human beings, right? The individuals may be sort of the way that he's thinking about them, but humans might be a little bit too far.
Yeah, I would think that the human side, because some of them he actually saw on the other side of the Atlantic when he was a slave trader. So he's seen some of them in real life as free people. And he's also seen free societies in West Africa before he became the plantation manager. And I think that's one of the major factors why he sees them more as individuals. And yet, as you say, at the same time, he's enslaving them. French Guyana, Cayenne, I should say, at the time, it was a small colony. and 1,000 Africans, 300 French people. So I think part of that, being a small and quite isolated society, that enabled that set up a kind of a situation where people knew each other as individuals a bit more, especially as the plantation was quite small as well, compared to Saint-Domingue, the future Haiti, which was going to be, where you had plantations of 200-300 people and regular new arrivals. Here you had an outpost where arrivals from West Africa were quite infrequent. So the population, the enslaved population, didn't change a whole lot. There wasn't the same level of turnover that you had in the Antilles. So I think that's another role. But yes, it's something I've been struggling with as well. And I still don't know why he was dismissed.
Mm.
And it seems crazy to say, well, was he dismissed for leniency?
Mm.
Because when you read what other planters did to the people they were managing, Goupy doesn't write about that. So maybe that was the problem. Maybe he was treating them too much as individuals, because he didn't last long in the job. 18 months for someone in that situation. By the time the correspondence goes to France, where the absentee owner was, and comes back, that's it means that within the first 6 months, Goupy was doing a very bad job. And it wasn't embezzlement either. So, yeah, it's a little bit, that's delving down into the micro history, I guess.
Yeah. Well, there's these interesting moments that you point out, like, for example, that that women weren't unmarried for long, right? That when would die, that they would sort of be impressed into, they would sort of be forced into a sort of, what we have to imagine is sort of as a form of sexual assault, right? That they had sort of say in this, and I think there's, of course, I think that you're right to point out that Goupy sees them as being individuals, and yet he still participates in the system, and maybe some of the things that are left unsaid in there, like the fact that this is sort of sexual assault and rape that's happening on these situations. It sort of seems to contradict maybe these
Well, one of the concerning the marriages question, because a new ship didn't arrive during his tenure, we didn't actually get to find out what his decision was. He didn't have any people to pair off. He didn't have any women to marry, as it were. So we don't know what he would have said. But he did say that that they should be free to choose their spouse. But then that was in the Code Noir from 1685. And the Code Noir wasn't always applied. It was something more used as a last resort when governors wanted to, punish a planter. Certainly in the early years, because we're only a few years after the Code Noir. So yeah, it is a struggle. And of course, there's always that tendency, the inherent bias, you sympathize with the author. And you think, okay, well, I'm reading this person's manuscript, they must be right. Or, you kind of absorb their viewpoint. So I've certainly been aware of that. And it's still something I'm struggling with. But as I say, when I contrast it with other reports from the time, it does seem as though he wasn't he wasn't treating them as labor units quite as much as other people were. But then it's a relative, it's all a relative system, because he just come from West Africa, where he sent thousands of people off across the Atlantic. So it's not trying to exculpate him, it's just trying to figure out what was going on.
I find that, really difficult, sort of research too, of excavating the daily life of the plantation, which of course would mean the daily life, which has historically been the daily life of the masters, right? The slave owners. But trying to find like the individuality and the sort of humanness of these people, you have to go through these sources. There's almost, it's very hard to find any other way to do so. Which means we necessarily end up talking a lot about Europe when we talk about this, instead of enslaved people.
Yeah.
That's what we have to do, I guess, in a sense. I want to go back to Ben's thing. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. I've got a question for Ben afterwards as well. So
actually, why don't you go ahead then?
Right. Well, I was just a very early visitor to Cayenne. Was a young man in the 1640s called Esprit Cabert de Villermont. And he became known later on as the author of a questionnaire that he sent to I think it was a captain or someone going out to India in about 1680 perhaps, asking all sorts of questions about the culture of the East. And I was wondering, I mean, would Bale have been in any correspondence? He's one of these figures who turns up, and he's very obscure, but he seems to be one of these figures right at the center, almost like, like Voltaire is the post office of Europe for the nexus of Europe, where you've got Cabert doing this in 1670s, 1680s.
Honestly, I could not really answer that question. The name sounds weirdly familiar, and I might be mistaken. I've recently finished a wonderful biography of Diderot by Andrew Curran, and I'm wondering if this character was not mentioned somewhere in the course of the text. So I could not really tell you about this specific historical figure. To answer more generally your question about the sources of Bale, especially when you come when you deal with this discourse on Buddhism. In the Spinoza article, there are two main sources. The main source is Alessandro Valignano, who was present in Japan during the 16th century. He was there after Francis Xavier as the leader of the mission, and he was a very prominent figure who tried to convert Japanese people to Christianity, and who produced this catechismus that was a kind of first summary of what people understood at the time about local religions, especially Buddhism, but also the local religion of Japan as well. So that's one important source for Bale, and this text came to Bale's attention through the Bibliotheca Selecta, was one of those missionary texts that was taught in Jesuit schools. So that's one important source. And also Bale has another source of information about Buddhism that comes not from Japan this time, but from China, and also from the Jesuits, from the Jesuit missions. And there is this book by Couplet, which was titled, I can't remember it right now, is the Confucius Sinarum, if I remember well. That's a kind of collective volume about Buddhism, about Chinese religions, and that was the fruits of the missionary presence in China. So those are two main sources for Bale when you talk about his understanding of Buddhism.
How do you think Bale is reacting? I mean, he was quite a committed Protestant, and he's reading Jesuit descriptions, and the Jesuits are very interested, like all of the missionaries, they were interested in the religion of the peoples they were trying to convert, because they were trying to tell people, future missionaries, this is what you're up against. This is what you need to bear in mind when you're trying to convert them. So how do you think Bale is looking at the text of a Catholic?
So actually, Bale was briefly in Toulouse a student of the Jesuits. And I believe that the story goes that he went first to a Protestant school, then he went to Jesuit school, and then there was this second kind of abjuration of the Catholic faith. And then he went into exile. So I think for him, like for Voltaire, the Jesuits were just his masters when he was a young student. Okay. So he came into contact with these texts during his personal education.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. We may have about 3 or 4 minutes left. Something we hadn't touched on. This by my count, I'm not sure. But if there's something we hadn't touched on that maybe you wanted to discuss with each other.
Yeah, I do have a question about your project, which sounds absolutely fascinating. And I really liked your conclusion. I found it sincerely very interesting when you said that basically you cannot project all this knowledge that you have about 19th century plantations and like apply it to what happened in the 17th century. Because as you said, like very eloquently in your paper, basically these people, the enslaved people, had a completely different experience, because some of them were like, they were born in Africa, they were free for a long time, whereas in the 19th century, your people were just like, well, unfortunately, the product of the plantation system. And I don't know if you're like familiar with his work, but there is this wonderful American writer, Colson Whitehead, who has published this amazing novel called The Underground Railroad, which recreates the plantation system, and in particular looks at this slave named Cora, who finds a way to escape. And there is like this extraordinary like mixture between like the real and a kind of Swift-like representation of the underground, like traveling across different spaces. So I'm wondering if you have ever been tempted in your research to also write creatively about these period.
Oh yes, but not as successfully as you, I suspect. But,
so do you have like a project, like for example, your project with Gopil, have you ever thought about like perhaps writing a kind of fake memoirs, or like what about Gopil from, for example, a side character that could be the fruit of your imagination? So what my question for you would be, what would be, for example, what would be the benefits of doing that? And what would you fear would be lacking should you make that decision to go for more creative writing kind of representation and leave the academic traditional representation of history?
yeah, well, I do have. I mean, it's one thing when you're dealing with a lot of manuscripts, there are always little side notes, little anecdotes that you can't use as an academic, but that make wonderful plots. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you'll see that, yeah, every era, I suspect. So yes, I've got some plots. I have a very nice outline. I have to do the Guppy book first. But it'd be something, it's from that era. But I can't, it would be very difficult to bring in or to make slavery the focus of it, I think. But certainly depictions of the era, depictions of slavery, but I don't feel it's for me to write the daily life from a fictional point of view.
This reminds me.
Oh, sorry, Colin.
No, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, but then, if it did well, then it would get the information out there, because as we've seen in recent weeks, a lot of discussion about history and, making people aware of history can be a very, very important thing.
As a side note, just as another bibliographic reference, Patrick Chamoiseau, his La Vieille Homme et le Molosse, it just came out years ago in a really brilliant English translation, Slave Old Man, which is a very similar kind of course, fictional sort of reimagined or representation of a slave fleeing a plantation, which also kind of lives in this like kind of magical realism-esque Caribbean, novel about a slave escaping the plantation. Sort of travel.
Well, part of the magic realism side of it is that there's the history is denied in the former places of slavery. Chamoiseau discusses it at length. I think it's in Texaco, it's in one of his works. Just the history is in oblivion, because it's almost better to forget about it. I mean, we actually in New Zealand, we're struggling with colonial history at the moment. So yeah, we're seeing that up close as well.
Well, I think we may be out of time for this discussion.
Oh, yeah.
I wish we could continue, but we've been doing this for a while now. We don't want to take up too much bandwidth. So I want to thank again William Jennings from the University of Waikato and Benjamin Hoffmann from the Ohio State University. Thank you all for this great conversation.
Thank you very much for being here with us today and for moderating the discussion, Colin.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very good.